Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mobile, Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The wooden boards of the old Ellington property creaked under the weight of history. In the autumn of 1843, when Mobile was still finding its footing as a bustling port city, something happened at the edge of town that few would speak of in the decades that followed. The Ellington farm stood approximately 3 miles from the city limits, nestled between the dense Alabama woodlands and what was then called the Lower Peach Orchard Road. The property itself was unremarkable. A modest farmhouse, a large red barn, and acres of cotton fields stretching toward the horizon. But what happened inside that barn would cast a long shadow over Mobile County for generations. Charles Ellington arrived in Mobile in the spring of 1838 with his wife Abigail and what neighbors described as quiet, almost invisible children. The family kept to themselves, which wasn't particularly unusual for the area. Many settlers valued their privacy. Charles quickly established himself as a capable farmer and occasional carpenter, though those who did business with him described him as peculiarly stern and a man of few words. Abigail was rarely seen in town after their first year of residence. According to the parish registry at St. Mary's Church, the Ellingtons had twin children baptized in 1832, a boy and a girl named Samuel and Sarah. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just what happened, but how ordinary everything appeared on the surface. The Ellington farm produced cotton, the family paid their taxes, and Charles was seen at the general store and church with reasonable regularity. Yet something was happening behind closed doors that wouldn't come to light until the winter of 1843, when a traveling salesman named James Woodruff took shelter from a storm in the Ellingtons' barn without permission. What Woodruff discovered that night would eventually lead to one of the earliest documented cases of extreme isolation and confinement in Alabama's history. But to understand what happened, we must first understand the Ellingtons themselves. Abigail Foster had married Charles Ellington in Charleston in 1830. Both came from respectable families, though Charles's father had lost much of the family fortune in failed shipping ventures. According to correspondence between Abigail and her sister Eleanor, preserved in the Mobile County Historical Society, the early years of their marriage were unremarkable. Their twins were born in 1832, and Charles worked as a clerk for a shipping company. What changed in Charles is difficult to pinpoint. A journal kept by Reverend Thomas Harding, who served at the church the Ellingtons attended in Charleston, notes that Charles became increasingly rigid in matters of discipline, following a financial setback in 1835. The family's move to Mobile in 1838 appears to have been precipitated by these financial difficulties, but also by what Abigail cryptically referred to in a letter as increasing tensions with neighbors regarding Charles's methods. The Ellington farm in Mobile was isolated by design. The nearest neighbor, the Peterson family, lived over a mile away. Mary Peterson, in a statement given to county officials in 1844, claimed that she had visited the Ellington home only once, shortly after their arrival. She described the interior as unnaturally ordered, and noted that the children sat perfectly still throughout our visit, speaking only when spoken to directly by their father. What's particularly troubling is that over the 5 years the Ellingtons lived in Mobile before the discovery, not a single person reported seeing the children attend school or church or play outdoors. Charles explained their absence by claiming they were of delicate constitution and educated at home. No one thought to question this further. In the scattered records of the area, there's no indication that anyone in the community expressed concern about the children's welfare or whereabouts. The silence was complicit. The isolation was perfect, until that stormy night in December of 1843. According to the sworn statement James Woodruff provided to county officials, he had been traveling through Mobile selling farm implements when a sudden, violent storm forced him to seek immediate shelter. Finding himself near the Ellington property, he ran for the barn. Inside, soaked and grateful for the shelter, Woodruff lit a small lantern he carried with his traveling goods. That's when he heard what he described as a sound like the scurrying of animals, but followed by what I can only describe as human whispering. Woodruff claimed he called out, identifying himself as a traveler seeking shelter from the storm, when he heard a distinct child's voice ask, "Are you from outside?" What Woodruff discovered in the corner of the barn has been described in multiple historical accounts, though the details vary slightly. What is consistent is that he found two children, approximately 11 years old, living in what was described as a cage-like structure built into the corner of the barn. According to Woodruff's statement, the children were severely malnourished, dressed in tattered clothing, and spoke in what he called a strange, limited vocabulary. When he asked their names, they identified themselves as boy and girl. When he asked how long they had been in the barn, the response was even more chilling. "Always here. This is where bad children live." Woodruff's discovery set in motion a series of events that would shock the community of Mobile. Records indicate that he left the barn immediately, despite the storm, and rode to town to alert the sheriff. By morning, Sheriff William Calloway and 3 deputies arrived at the Ellington farm. What they found was documented in official records that were sealed until 1962, when historian Margaret Hollings uncovered them while researching early law enforcement in Alabama. The official report describes a structure built within the barn that consisted of a wooden pen approximately 8 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling too low for an adult to stand upright. Inside were crude sleeping pallets, a bucket for waste, and what was described as primitive drawings scratched into the wooden walls. The children were found huddled in one corner, displaying what the report called extreme fear of the outside and of adult presence. Charles Ellington, when confronted by Sheriff Calloway, reportedly showed no remorse or concern. According to the sheriff's report, his only response was, "They are my children to raise as I see fit." Abigail Ellington was found in the farmhouse, described by deputies as appearing withdrawn and unresponsive to questioning. Later examination by Dr. James Morrow, the county physician, would suggest that Abigail herself may have been subjected to years of intimidation and control. The medical report prepared by Dr. Morrow makes for grim reading. The children, confirmed to be Samuel and Sarah Ellington, showed signs of long-term nutritional deficiency, limited muscle development, and what Dr. Morrow described as a profound lack of normal social development. Their skin was pale to the point of translucence, suggesting they had rarely, if ever, been exposed to sunlight. Most disturbing was Dr. Morrow's observation that the children appear to have developed their own simplified language to communicate with each other, while their grasp of common English is severely limited. What had happened at the Ellington farm? The investigation revealed a pattern of escalating control and isolation that had begun years earlier. According to testimony from former neighbors in Charleston, Charles had begun keeping the children indoors constantly after they had what he called a serious transgression at age 4. What this transgression was is never specified in any records, though speculation has ranged from normal childhood misbehavior to Charles potentially suffering from delusions. The move to Mobile appears to have been calculated to allow for complete isolation. Once there, according to what investigators pieced together, Charles moved the children to the barn structure when they were approximately 6 years old, around 1838. For 5 years they lived in that confined space, fed minimally, and with apparently no contact with anyone outside the immediate family. Abigail, in her later testimony, claimed that Charles had threatened her life if she attempted to free the children or seek help. The community's reaction to the discovery was one of shock and collective guilt. Reverend James Wilson of the Mobile First Baptist Church was quoted in the Mobile Register as saying, "We have all failed these children by our inattention and unwillingness to question what was before us." The newspaper account describes how neighbors began to recall strange sounds from the Ellington property that they had dismissed or ignored over the years. The legal proceedings against Charles Ellington were swift by standards of the time. He was charged with child cruelty and false imprisonment, among the earliest such cases recorded in Alabama. The court records indicate he offered no defense beyond claiming parental authority. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor, though historical records indicate he died of typhoid fever after serving only 3 years of his sentence. Abigail Ellington's fate was more complex. Initially charged as an accomplice, testimony from the children and Dr. Morrow's psychological assessment led the court to view her as another victim of Charles's control. She was ultimately not prosecuted, but historical records indicate she never recovered from the ordeal. Parish records from St. Mary's Church note her death in 1846, just 3 years after the children were discovered. What happened to Samuel and Sarah Ellington? This is where the historical record becomes both sparse and deeply troubling. They were initially placed in the care of the county orphanage, where reports indicate they struggled to adapt to normal social interaction. A notation in the orphanage records from 1844 states that the Ellington children remain largely non-verbal with anyone but each other and display extreme distress when separated even briefly. A more detailed assessment by Dr. Morrow, 6 months after their rescue, noted that, while showing some physical improvement, the psychological impact of their confinement appears to be permanent. They exhibit no understanding of normal social customs, limited language acquisition despite attempts at education, and continuous fear of enclosed spaces paradoxically combined with fear of open areas. The last official record of the Ellington children comes from 1847, when they would have been approximately 15 years old. The Mobile County Orphanage recorded their transfer to what was then called the Alabama State Hospital for the Insane, now known as Bryce Hospital in Tuscaloosa. The transfer document simply states that due to their continued inability to adapt to normal society and their dependency on each other to the exclusion of all others, more specialized care is required than this institution can provide. No further records of Samuel and Sarah Ellington have ever been found in public archives. Historian Margaret Hollings, who uncovered much of this case in the 1960s, noted in her papers that the trail goes cold after their transfer to the state hospital. Like many patients of that era, they likely lived out their lives in institutional care, their names eventually reduced to entries in logbooks that have long since been lost to time or decay. The physical evidence of the Ellington case has similarly vanished. The farm was sold in 1844 to the Henderson family, who, perhaps understandably, tore down the barn and built a new one on a different part of the property. The farmhouse burned down in 1867. Today, the land where these events took place is part of a suburban development on the outskirts of Mobile. Nothing remains to mark what happened there. But the case left other kinds of marks. The discovery of the Ellington children led to some of the earliest discussions in Alabama about parental rights versus child welfare. The Mobile Register editorials from 1844 include several pieces debating the extent to which communities should interfere in family matters when abuse is suspected. Reverend Wilson used the case in sermons about community responsibility, preserved in church records, arguing that Christian duty extends to protecting the most vulnerable among us, even when it means questioning the actions of our neighbors. Perhaps the most tangible legacy is a section of Alabama legal code regarding child welfare that was enacted in 1848, referenced in historical legal analyses as being directly influenced by the Ellington case, though not mentioning it by name. These early protections were limited by modern standards, but represented some of the first legal recognitions in the state that children had rights that could supersede parental authority. The Ellington case faded from public memory relatively quickly, as such cases often did in an era before mass media. By the 1850s, it was rarely mentioned in local newspapers. By the end of the century, it was largely forgotten, except as a vague local legend about the children in the barn. In 1962, when Margaret Hollings uncovered the court records during research for her doctoral thesis on early Alabama legal history, she brought the case back into limited academic awareness. Her paper, Captives of Parental Authority, the Ellington Case and Early Child Welfare Law, was published in the Alabama Historical Quarterly but reached few outside academic circles. The most unsettling aspect of the Ellington case isn't just what happened to those children, but how easily it happened. A community of otherwise decent, observant people simply failed to see, or chose not to see, what was happening literally in their midst. The children disappeared from public view gradually, explanation by explanation, until they were erased entirely. No one questioned, no one investigated. The silence around the Ellington farm was complete until broken by a traveler's chance discovery during a storm. When Sheriff Calloway was interviewed by the Mobile Register after the trial, he made a statement that resonates disturbingly even today. The most troubling part is not what Ellington did, though that is monstrous enough. It's that he did it in plain sight, confident that no one would question him, and he was right until luck intervened. The story of Samuel and Sarah Ellington serves as a grim reminder of what can happen in the shadows of isolation, when communities fail in their obligation to protect their most vulnerable members. For 5 years, those children lived in darkness just 3 miles from a bustling community. They scratched their simple drawings into the wooden walls of their prison, developed their private language, and waited for a rescue that only came by the merest chance. In the archives of Bryce Hospital, there is a collection of patient artwork preserved from the 19th century. Among them is a simple drawing on yellowed paper, catalogued only as Patient Drawing, Guernica 37, circa 1850. It shows 2 stick figures holding hands inside what appears to be a box or room. Above them is a crude rendering of what might be a window or opening, with lines coming through it that could represent light. There is no artist's name attached. Hospital archivists have never connected this drawing to the Ellington children, and there is no way to confirm if it was indeed created by one of them. But for those familiar with their story, it's difficult not to see in those simple lines the lasting impact of those 5 years in the barn, a longing for light, for connection, for escape. The Ellington farm is gone now. The barn is gone. The court records gather dust in archives. Even the academic papers about the case are rarely read. But somewhere in the psychological understanding of trauma and isolation, in the legal frameworks designed to protect children, in the community obligations we now recognize, the echo of what happened to Samuel and Sarah Ellington in Mobile, Alabama, in the 1840s, continues to resonate. The next time you pass an isolated home, hear a strange sound from a neighbor's property, or notice a child who has stopped appearing in public, remember the Ellington barn. Some silences should be broken. Some doors should be opened. One aspect of the Ellington case that remains particularly troubling is the extent to which Charles Ellington created a system of control that extended beyond physical confinement. According to Dr. Morrow's notes, which were included as an appendix to his official medical report, the children had developed a complex relationship with their captor that defied simple explanation. The children exhibit both extreme fear of their father and a paradoxical desire for his approval, Dr. Morrow wrote. When asked about their confinement, they repeatedly stated that it was necessary and that they were being made better. This psychological conditioning appears to have been reinforced through a system of rewards and punishments that the children described in fragmented terms during their initial interviews. Sheriff Calloway's deputy, Jonathan Reed, kept a personal journal of his involvement in the case, which was donated to the Mobile Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1958. In it, he describes how Samuel would become visibly distressed when given more than a small portion of food, insisting that "Father says too much makes the badness grow." The badness was a recurring theme in the children's limited communications. According to multiple sources who interacted with them in the months following their rescue, both Samuel and Sarah believed they harbored some innate corruption that their confinement was meant to control or eliminate. Dr. Morrow's notes include a particularly disturbing exchange with Sarah, who, when asked why they were kept in the barn, reportedly replied, "The darkness keeps the badness sleeping. Father says if we stay in the light too long, everyone will see what's inside us." What Charles Ellington told his children about this supposed badness remains unclear. None of his personal writings were recovered during the investigation, if such writings ever existed. Abigail Ellington, during her brief period of lucidity during questioning, claimed that Charles believed the children had been marked by sin from birth, due to what he perceived as Abigail's insufficient piety during pregnancy. However, court records indicate that Abigail's mental state was considered too fragile for her testimony to be deemed entirely reliable. The psychological impact of this indoctrination became tragically clear during early attempts to rehabilitate the children. Records from the Mobile County Orphanage describe how both children would become severely agitated at sunrise, attempting to hide from the daylight. Martha Simmons, a caretaker at the orphanage, noted in her log from January 1844 that the Ellington boy spent the morning pressed into the corner, covering his face and repeatedly murmuring, "The light will show it, the light will show it." The orphanage records also detail the children's remarkable dependency on one another. In one particularly notable incident, Sarah became physically ill when separated from her brother for a medical examination, developing symptoms so severe that the staff feared for her life. Similarly, Samuel reportedly stopped speaking entirely during the 3 hours they were apart, resuming communication only when returned to his sister's presence. This bond, while providing them some comfort, ultimately complicated efforts to integrate them into the orphanage's general population. Reverend Wilson, who took a personal interest in the children's welfare and visited them regularly at the orphanage, wrote in a letter to a colleague in Birmingham that their isolation has created in them a world of two, complete unto itself, with rules and meanings impenetrable to outsiders. Whether this private universe was a sanctuary that preserved their sanity or an additional prison that now prevents their recovery is a question that haunts me. The depth of Charles Ellington's deception of the outside world becomes even more disturbing when examining what few community records mention the family. The tax assessment rolls for 1842, preserved in the county archives, list the Ellington property as containing 1 dwelling house, 1 barn, agricultural implements, and makes note of cotton production sufficient to place the family in the middle economic tier of local farmers. There is nothing in these public records to suggest anything amiss. Similarly, the church attendance registry from the First Baptist Church of Mobile shows Charles Ellington present at Sunday services approximately twice monthly between 1838 and 1843. Reverend Wilson's church notes, reviewed after the discovery, contain a single reference to Charles asking for prayers for his sickly children in 1840. No one thought to question why these supposedly ill children were never brought to church or seen by a doctor. Perhaps most chilling is the account of Thomas Green, the local miller who purchased cotton from the Ellington farm. In his statement to investigators, he noted that on multiple occasions over the years, he had heard sounds from the barn while conducting business with Charles, but had dismissed them as likely farm animals. Green's statement concludes with words that echo the community's collective failure. He spoke so normally about everyday matters. We would discuss the weather, the cotton prices, politics sometimes. How does a man do that, knowing what's in his barn? And how did I not recognize the sounds for what they were? The children's slow deterioration under their father's care appears to have been matched by that of their mother. Neighbors who occasionally saw Abigail in the early days after the family's arrival in Mobile described her as quiet but composed. By 1841, the few sightings reported describe her as ghost-like and moving as if in a trance. Charles's control over his wife seems to have been nearly as complete as his control over his children, though exercised differently. Dr. Morrow's examination of Abigail following the children's discovery found her suffering from severe malnourishment and what he described as a profound melancholy that has rendered her nearly catatonic. His notes suggest that Charles employed a combination of physical intimidation, food restriction, and psychological manipulation to ensure her compliance and silence. One particularly disturbing detail emerged from Abigail's sister Eleanor, who, upon learning of the case, traveled from Charleston to Mobile. She reported that in the last letter she had received from Abigail, dated 1839, her sister had written, "Charles says that if I am obedient and accept his wisdom in all matters, the children may one day be allowed to return to the house. I live for that day." The precise beginning of the children's confinement remains somewhat unclear. Based on the assembled evidence, investigators believed it began as restriction to the house sometime around 1836, with the move to the barn structure occurring after the family's relocation to Mobile. This timeline suggests a gradual escalation of control and isolation, rather than a sudden decision. This pattern of escalation is consistent with what modern psychology understands about controlling behavior. Dr. Julian Haynes, who reviewed the historical case records in 1967 while researching his book on historical child abuse cases, noted that the Ellington case shows the classic progression from conventional discipline to extreme control, with each step normalized before proceeding to the next level of restriction. The geographical isolation of the Mobile property simply removed the last barriers to Charles Ellington's complete domination of his family. The question that haunted investigators and continues to trouble those who study the case is what motivated Charles Ellington. No clear answer emerges from the historical record. Reverend Harding's journal from Charleston mentions that Charles had been raised in a strict religious household and had unusual ideas about sin and punishment, but provides no specific details. Charles's own statements during his trial offer little insight, as he maintained throughout that he was simply exercising his rightful authority as father and husband. One theory, proposed by Margaret Hollings in her 1962 analysis, suggests that Charles's financial failures in Charleston may have triggered a psychological need to assert absolute control in other areas of his life. Unable to master his financial circumstances, Hollings wrote, Ellington turned to his family as the domain where his authority could be absolute. Another perspective comes from Dr. Haynes, who suggested that Charles might have suffered from a severe personality disorder, possibly exacerbated by the isolation of frontier life. The case predates modern psychological diagnosis by more than a century, Haynes noted, but the pattern of behavior is consistent with what we would now recognize as pathological control and possibly delusional beliefs about his children. Whatever the cause, the consequences were devastating and far-reaching. The impact extended beyond the immediate victims to affect the entire community of Mobile. The Mobile Register's coverage of the case triggered what one editorial called a season of uncomfortable reflection among local citizens. Church attendance reportedly increased in the weeks following the discovery, and Reverend Wilson's sermons on community responsibility drew unprecedented crowds. Sheriff Calloway, according to his annual report to the county commissioners in 1844, instituted a new policy requiring his deputies to make regular inquiry about the welfare of children in remote households. This appears to be one of the earliest formalized child welfare check programs in the state, though limited by the standards and resources of the time. The case also sparked a contentious debate about privacy versus community oversight. Letters to the editor of the Mobile Register show a community deeply divided, with some arguing for greater scrutiny of isolated families and others warning against government intrusion into domestic affairs. One letter, signed only "A Concerned Citizen," asked, "If we begin inspecting our neighbors' methods of child rearing, where does such oversight end? Are we to have sheriffs peering in windows to ensure children are properly fed and clothed?" In response, another writer countered, "Had someone peered through Ellington's windows years ago, 2 children might have been spared immeasurable suffering." This tension between family privacy and child protection continues to shape legal and social policy to the present day. In this sense, the Ellington case represents not just a historical tragedy, but an early chapter in an ongoing societal negotiation about the boundaries of parental authority and the community's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members. The physical environment of the children's confinement, while described in official documents, was detailed most vividly in Deputy Reed's personal journal. He wrote that the structure inside the barn had been built with disturbing care and forethought. The walls were solid oak, the single door secured with 3 separate locks, and the small barred opening that provided minimal light and air was positioned too high for the children to see through. Reed noted that the interior showed signs of having been regularly cleaned, with fresh straw on the floor, suggesting a prison maintained with methodical attention. Most disturbing to modern sensibilities is Reed's description of what he called the teaching wall. One interior wall of the structure contained what appeared to be rules or maxims carved into the wood, including phrases like "darkness cleanses" and "obedience brings light." Reed wrote that these carvings appeared to have been made by an adult hand, presumably Charles's, and were positioned to be constantly visible to the children. The children themselves had created markings of their own on the opposite wall, hundreds of small scratches that investigators initially couldn't interpret. It was Dr. Morrow who first suggested they might be a calendar of sorts, a way for the children to track the passage of time in their windowless confinement. This theory gained support when Samuel, during one of his more communicative moments at the orphanage, was shown a drawing of the marks and reportedly said, "sleep counts." These physical details of the confinement space suggest a calculated approach to isolation that went beyond mere restriction. Charles appears to have created an environment designed not just to contain the children physically, but to shape their understanding of the world and themselves. The psychological impact of living in such conditions during crucial developmental years explains much about the children's profound difficulties reintegrating into society. The rescue of the Ellington children might never have happened if not for a confluence of unlikely events. James Woodruff's decision to seek shelter in that particular barn during that particular storm was itself improbable. That he carried a lantern, that the children chose to reveal themselves rather than hiding from the stranger, that Woodruff immediately recognized the gravity of the situation and rode through the storm to alert authorities. Each link in this chain could easily have broken, leaving the children undiscovered. Sheriff Calloway acknowledged this element of chance in his annual report, writing, "It sobers the mind to consider how many similar situations might exist, unknown to authorities, waiting for a stroke of fortune that may never arrive." The legal proceedings against Charles Ellington were remarkable for their time. Criminal trials in 1840s Alabama were typically brief affairs, especially in cases not involving property disputes or homicide. The court records indicate that Ellington's trial lasted 3 full days, an unusually long proceeding for the period. The charges of cruel confinement and child maltreatment required the prosecution to establish legal principles that had rarely been tested in state courts. Judge Henry Olmsted, who presided over the case, found himself navigating largely uncharted legal territory. His written opinion, preserved in the state judicial archives, acknowledges this challenge. While the law has long recognized a father's authority to discipline his children according to his judgment, there must exist some boundary beyond which such authority cannot extend. To find otherwise would be to sanction tyranny within the family circle, which no civilized society can countenance. Olmsted's ruling established, perhaps for the first time in Alabama jurisprudence, that parental authority had limits that could be enforced by the state. He sentenced Charles to 20 years hard labor, a sentence described in the Mobile Register as unprecedented in its severity for a case not involving loss of life. The Ellington case remains significant in legal history for this early recognition of children's right to protection from extreme parental abuse. Legal scholars have cited Judge Olmsted's opinion in subsequent cases involving child welfare, establishing it as an important, if largely forgotten, precedent in the development of family law in the United States. The aftermath of the case brought little closure or comfort. Abigail Ellington, after her husband's conviction, was briefly housed with a church family in Mobile before her deteriorating condition led to her commitment to the same state hospital where her children would later be sent. Parish records note her death in 1846, with Reverend Wilson conducting a small service attended primarily by church members who had never actually met her. Charles Ellington's death from typhoid fever in 1847, while serving his sentence at the state penitentiary in Wetumpka, was noted only briefly in the prison records. No family members claimed his body, and he was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave, a final obscurity that seems fitting given the hidden nature of his crimes. The Henderson family, who purchased the Ellington property in 1844, reportedly struggled with the farm's dark history. According to local accounts, Mrs. Henderson insisted that the barn be dismantled immediately, with the wood burned rather than reused. The family built a new barn on the opposite side of the property and, according to church records, had Reverend Wilson perform a blessing of the entire farm before they would occupy it. Despite these precautions, rumors persisted about the property for years. Mary Henderson's diary, portions of which were published in a collection of pioneer women's writings in 1955, mentions that local children would dare each other to spend the night on the former site of the Ellington barn, believing it to be haunted. "It troubles me that such a sorrowful true story has transformed into ghost tales," she wrote in 1852. "The real horror that occurred here needs no supernatural embellishment. The most enduring mystery of the case remains the fate of Samuel and Sarah Ellington after their transfer to the state hospital in 1847. Dr. Haynes, during his research in the 1960s, made extensive efforts to locate records of their care or eventual disposition, but found only the initial admission documents. The hospital's patient records from that period were largely destroyed in a fire in 1884, leaving a permanent gap in the historical record. The most that can be pieced together comes from scattered references in hospital administrative documents. A budget report from 1853 lists expenditures for special accommodations for mutual dependency cases, which some historians believe may refer to the Ellington twins. An inventory from 1859 mentions the connected rooms in the East Wing, again possibly referring to special arrangements for the twins. After this, there is simply nothing. Margaret Hollings, in the conclusion of her 1962 paper, wrote, "The silence that surrounds the ultimate fate of the Ellington children is perhaps appropriate, if deeply unsatisfying to the historian. Their lives began in obscurity, continued in isolation, and ended in archival absence. They remain shadows moving at the edges of the historical record, their voices largely unheard, their experiences incompletely understood. This archival silence extends to any potential descendants of the extended Ellington family. Charles had 2 brothers, according to records in Charleston, but efforts to trace their lineage have yielded little information. Abigail's sister Eleanor returned to Charleston after her brief visit to Mobile and disappears from the historical record shortly thereafter. The family line, like the physical evidence of their existence in Mobile, seems to have been erased by time. What remains instead is the impact of their story on law, on community practice, and on our understanding of the profound vulnerabilities of children in isolated circumstances. The case predates mandatory education laws, child labor restrictions, and formalized child protective services by decades, yet it helped establish the principle that would eventually underpin all these developments, that children have rights that exist independently of parental authority. In 1969, when Alabama revised its child welfare statutes, the legislative record includes a reference to the tragic cases of the past century that demonstrated the need for systematic protection. While not mentioned by name, the Ellington case is widely believed to be among those the legislators had in mind. Today, the land where the Ellington farm once stood is part of a suburban development called Meadow Creek Estates. There is no historical marker, no commemoration of what occurred there. The development was built in the 1980s, long after the last people with living memory of the case had passed away. The residents likely have no idea of the history beneath their comfortable homes. This forgetting is itself part of the story. Communities often struggle to memorialize their darkest chapters, preferring to let painful histories fade rather than confront them directly. Yet in the archives, in legal precedents, and in the development of social welfare systems, the echoes of the Ellington case remain for those who know where to look. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the case is one that cannot be measured or documented, the heightened awareness, however temporary, that followed in its wake. How many children were spared similar fates because a neighbor, remembering the Ellington case, chose to question a family's unusual isolation? How many parents, tempted toward excessive control, were restrained by the community scrutiny that followed? These prevented tragedies leave no historical trace, but they may represent the case's most meaningful impact. As Dr. Haynes wrote in the conclusion of his book, the Ellington case teaches us that the most dangerous predators are not strangers lurking in shadows, but can be those society grants the greatest authority and the least oversight. The father, cloaked in respectability and legal authority, committed his crimes not in moments of passion, but through years of calculated control, hidden behind the walls of family privacy that communities were reluctant to breach. This reluctance to interfere in family matters continues to complicate child protection efforts to the present day. Modern mandatory reporting laws, curriculum requirements, and regular medical examinations for children all serve as systemic safeguards that might have saved the Ellington children had they existed in 1843. Yet these systems remain imperfect, balanced against deeply held beliefs about family privacy and parental rights. The story of the Ellington children serves as a grim reminder of what can happen in these unobserved spaces. Their experience speaks across more than a century and a half to modern concerns about homeschooling oversight, isolated religious communities, and the challenges of protecting children in remote rural areas where social services are stretched thin. In the final analysis, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Ellington case is not its unique horror, but its potential commonality. For every discovered case of extreme abuse, how many remain hidden? The question that troubled Sheriff Calloway in 1844 troubles child protection professionals still. The barn where Samuel and Sarah Ellington spent 5 years of their childhood is long gone. The medical reports, trial transcripts, and newspaper accounts exist now only as yellowing papers in archives or as brief mentions in historical analyses. Even this retelling adds just another layer of distance between the present and the actual lived experience of those children in that dark space. Yet their story retains its power to disturb and to instruct. It reminds us that the most vulnerable among us depend entirely on the willingness of others to see, to question, and to act. It stands as a testament to how completely a family can disappear from public view while remaining physically present in a community. Most of all, it demonstrates how thin the line can be between respected privacy and dangerous isolation. The final word on the Ellington case might best belong to Deputy Jonathan Reed, who wrote in his journal after the trial, "I have looked into dark corners in this work before, but never one so carefully constructed and maintained. It teaches me to look more carefully at what appears ordinary on the surface, to question what seems unremarkable, to wonder what might lie behind the quiet farmhouse door. Some silences speak volumes, if only we would listen." In Mobile today, few remember the Ellington case. The archives where the records reside are visited primarily by academic researchers and local history enthusiasts. The legal precedents established by Judge Olmsted have been superseded by more comprehensive child protection statutes. The case exists now primarily as a historical footnote, an early milestone on the long road toward recognizing children's fundamental rights to safety and care. Yet for those who study the dark corners of family history, who seek to understand the development of child protection systems, or who work daily at the complex intersection of family privacy and child welfare, the Ellington case remains disturbingly relevant. The questions it raised about community responsibility, legal intervention, and the limits of parental authority continue to challenge us today. The barn is gone. The children's fate is unknown. The legal system that failed them has evolved, but the fundamental human dynamics that allowed their suffering, the respect for authority that prevented questioning, the privacy that enabled abuse, the collective looking away, these remain constant concerns in every community. Perhaps that is why the case continues to haunt those who encounter it in the archives. Not because it is unique, but because it is not. Not because it is a relic of a less enlightened past, but because its essential dynamics persist into the present. Not because it happened to strangers long ago, but because it could happen again, just beyond our line of sight, if we allow ourselves the comfort of not looking too closely at the quiet house down the road where the children are rarely seen. The darkness that enveloped Samuel and Sarah Ellington for those 5 years in the barn has, in a sense, never fully lifted. Their story, incomplete and partially obscured, stands as both warning and challenge, a reminder that the most vulnerable among us depend entirely on others' willingness to see beyond appearances, to question authority when necessary, and to recognize that some silences should never be respected. Listen carefully, then, for the sounds that don't belong. Look closely at the absences that should be presences. question the explanations that don't quite satisfy. The Ellington children would have been saved years of suffering if just one person had done these things. How many others wait, even now, for someone to notice what is not being shown, to hear what is not being said, to act on the suspicion that something is deeply wrong behind the ordinary facade? The most terrifying aspect of the Ellington case is not what we know happened, but the possibility of what might be happening still, unseen and unaddressed, in the quiet houses where children's voices are never heard.